Hello and welcome to this video where I really want to discuss free jazz, and I want to put it in the context of jazz fusion as well. There's so many videos about the history of jazz fusion on this channel that I'm not going to try and do a definitive history of jazz fusion. In fact, there is a video out there if you want to check it out which looks at the roots and the origins of jazz fusion. But what I want to look here is the origins of free jazz and how that relates to jazz fusion. All right. If you're following my jazz history, I've missed out the 1950s a little bit. I've talked about them in I think it was part 4 a little bit. You know, this idea of West Coast and East Coast jazz. You know, you've got the cool jazz. Emergence. You've got hard bop emerge. You've sort of got a third stream emerge, which is sort of like a progressive rock version of jazz, where you've got a lot more classical influences, and those are the styles that are going through. There's also, they've clawed back some commerciality. So people like Brubeck are selling records, unlike the beboppers. Brubeck's selling records, Miles is selling records. They're selling a lot of records, and they've done that by tempering the bebop influences and bringing back more commercial, sort of almost like easy listening. Nobody wants to say that, but Miles Davis in the 50s, when he's doing Someday My Prince Will Come, that is more easy listening than listening to Coco by Charlie Parker, right? So jazz musicians throughout this, right, on the one hand they're trying to make it more commercial, but how do you make it more commercial? What is the problem with bebop? Well, a lot of it is that it's harmonically and rhythmically so advanced, and this must be the straitjacket for musicians. And I think it's a terrible thing. I think the bebop influence on jazz musicians has held jazz back as much as it's pushed it forward. All the great jazz musicians who were innovators have turned their back on bebop in some way, because those jazz musicians are trying to find a way of expanding the form. So the thing about bebop, where you've got, you take the chord progression and you expand on it, which makes it more harmonically richer, but more difficult to solo through. And someone like a genius like Charlie Parker can solo through those changes using the upper colour tones of the chords. He can fly through the changes, right? These changes are really like often blues-based changes or rhythm changes, but you've expanded on them using 2-5-1 chord progressions. And so, the jazz musicians are trying to play through these 2-5-1s and expand on that. The musicians of the 50s, you could tell they're all trying to push against that. How do we free ourselves from the tyranny of the chord progression? How do we free jazz? All right? And there's a number of ways of doing this. So you could do one of the methods that John Coltrane used. Just one, because Coltrane tried to push against this in a number of ways. But one of the methods he did was to take that 2-5-1 and go, can I play that 2-5-1 in all keys? So if I can play it in 2 lines, I can play anything because I've expanded, I've broken out of the sort of diatonic trap that I'm in. So he comes up with a thing called the Coltrane matrix, which is basically where you're playing a 2-5-1, but there's a related 2-5-1, a major third away from that, and then another 2-5-1 away from that. If you put it on the cycle of fifths, it creates a triangle. And so if you take that standard form and do that, you end up with which are the giant steps changes. And giant steps is rapidly changing key between 3 related keys. You're sort of playing in 3 keys that are equally far apart from each other. This includes all 12 notes, and it includes 3 lots of cadences, which is pulling your ear in 3 different ways. And I think what Coltrane was trying to do with giant steps was break the harmony. Right? Often when you hear the free jazz that Coltrane's playing, he's still playing the Coltrane matrix. You can hear him go as he darts around between those 3 keys. He's trying to break open harmony, and this is one of the ways that that was come up in the 50s by Coltrane. That was one of the ways he tried to do that. Another way really comes from a modal approach to jazz, which is where rather than basing your system on the chord progressions, which is a very Western harmonic system. You base it on a scale, which is a much more sort of Indian and also African way of playing. And George Russell is the real genius behind this, who was a jazz theorist, and he really tried to reassign jazz, so rather than being based around a sort of major scale route, it was based around a sort of Lydian mode route. That way of thinking about modes actually changes when musicians start to use modes, and it changes by the 1960s into what I call the chord scale approach, which is where you would have a minor chord, and then that minor chord you could approach it with a number of modes. You might approach it with a Dorian mode or Phrygian mode or Aeolian mode, which again, if you do that, will expand out into all 12 notes. But the modal system is really made popular by Miles Davis on Kind of Blue. Now, Kind of Blue is an album of blues. This is something that people forget. They're all blues derived, but he's taking a modal approach to the blues on Kind of Blue, and that gives musicians more space. John Coltrane is also going to be very, very important in approaching a modal point of view. He does this really successfully on My Favourite Things, where he takes a jazz standard, because you can see with Coltrane's almost like trapped by, how do I break out of this jazz standard chord? He wants to be able to play the tunes, and what he does on My Favourite Things is he plays My Favourite Things, he goes through the tunes, plays through the chords, and then when he comes around to solo, he hits the first two chords, which I think is like a D minor to E minor, and when you go D minor to E minor over and over again, that then creates a modal backing for you, which is like would be a D Dorian mode. And then he plays in D Dorian mode, but he also expands on it. When you listen to Miles playing over modes on Kind of Blue, he's really within the mode, he's just playing the mode. Coltrane starts to expand on it by inferring different changes and going outside the scale to parallel scales because of his Coltrane matrix, right? Now, there's another way of freeing jazz, and this actually has its roots with Lenny Tristano in the late 1940s. Lenny Tristano was one of these third stream progressive musicians that really came out of like Stan Kenton's band. People like Lee Konitz were the same. Warren Marsh was another one of these musicians. And Lenny Tristano abandoned playing through chord changes. He just said, let's just not just play whatever we want. Right, and he did this in the 1940s. This album never gets mentioned. You know, Lenny Tristano freed jazz in the late 40s. You know, check it out. But the musician that then does that in the late 50s is Ornette Coleman. 10 years later, Ornette Coleman starts to do pretty much the same thing. And what Ornette Coleman's doing, he's not using a modal approach, and he's not trying to break harmony open using like the Coltrane matrix or expanding the chords so advanced that you can sort of play anything. What he does is he goes, I'm not going to play with an emphasis on the chords. The chords are there, and I may play them, but I'm going to consider the melody. I'm going to consider the harmony. I'm going to consider the logic and the motion of what I'm playing. So if I played a phrase to a chord change, but that phrase wants to go there, I'm going to let it go there, and I may come back to the chord changes. Ornette Coleman does play over changes, right? But he doesn't have to follow them anymore. I found this absolutely revolutionary for me. You know, as a young jazz musician trying to struggle to play bebop, which I couldn't do very well, and so often when you're doing this and you're listening to like bebop musicians and the more advanced musicians like Coltrane, there's a thing where they're going, you know, here we've got a major chord here, but either that major chord I can play first, third and fifth, but I could also play a sharp 4 if I want. I could play a major 7, or I could play a flattened 7 and then turn that major chord into a dominant chord. I could play the 6 or the flat 6, you know, which would be like a flat 13, you know, which would be hinting a sort of harmonic major sound, and you know, so you get to the point where you're going, right, I can justify whatever note I want, because the truth is that the justification of that note doesn't actually come from the harmonic backing of that chord. All right, this is a revolution to me. The phrasing, the motion of the phrase actually is so important to whether someone classes that note as being in or out. Okay, so with my students, I often say, look, get someone to sit next to you, get them to play a chord you don't know, and then just play any note against that chord. And that note's going to it's either going to be smack in tune here, right here it's going to be smack in tune, or right here it's going to be out of tune. But most likely it's going to be in the middle, because notes aren't in or out of tune. It varies, So if you take a C major chord, the C note will be smack in tune. The C sharp will be pretty out of tune. But the D, which is a 9, is somewhere in between, right? The D sharp or E flat, the flat third, is going to sound very bluesy over a major chord. It's going to be discordant, but you're going to hear it as being a sort of blues discordant, because that's a blue note, right? The E is going to be in tune. The F, which is from the major scale and should be in tune, is actually horrendously out of tune, but the F sharp is quite nice, but that will give you a Lydian sound. Right, this is amazing for me, that these notes are varying their out of tuneness. So their reason to be there is actually down to my phrasing, not to some harmonic system. Right, that I can play any note I want, but it's all down to the logic of how I got there. Okay, so in simple terms, if you play a note for a short amount of time that's out of tune, but resolve it very quickly, the audience won't even think it's out of tune. If you logically move to a note which is out of tune and make it a featured note, they're going to go, oh wow, that's taken me to a strange place. That's quite cool, that is. I think this is the great innovation of Ornette Coleman. Ornette Coleman's a difficult musician to get, but Ornette Coleman is one of the great musicians of the late 50s. He really invents free jazz by solving the problem in that way. It doesn't mean you can play anything. It's harder. It means you have to listen. You have to listen to the logic of what's going on and follow it through to its logical end. And if you do that, you can free what you're playing. It's like having a conversation. It's like these videos. Anyone watching these videos knows that I do not plan. I do not even plan the subject matter a lot of the time for these videos. This video here, I decided what to talk about, which was free jazz against fusion, just before I switched on record. Right? And I actually have done an Ornette Coleman thing, because here we are 12 minutes in, and I haven't actually got to the point I wanted to make. Right, and the point I wanted to make, which I'll now try and get back on track, and this is what Ornette Coleman does. It allows you to do this within music. It's like having a conversation. The conversation goes off in a certain direction. I think Miles' great quintet of the 60s with Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, we're doing the same thing. That really is the innovation of free jazz. It's just going, let's let the music go where you want it to go. Of course, by this time, you've really the albums become the art form for jazz, and so you can make like 10, 15-minute tracks. You can allow the music to go off in a certain direction, right? Okay, so we start to get this great innovation in jazz, which is free jazz. It's difficult music. The general public don't quite get it. But there's a revolution going on in rock music. Rock music in the 1960s is emerging, and that. It goes from sort of rock and roll to rock music to some progressive rock, acid rock, psychedelic rock. And I think, especially in, say, Coltrane's case, some of the late 60s Coltrane's albums are really way out, and some of the Ornette Coleman are way out. But these bands are influencing the rock musicians. The rock musicians don't have the chops to play bebop, but what Ornette Coleman does, they get. A group like the Grateful Dead is a rock version of the Ornette Coleman group. In fact, I've got Ornette Coleman albums with, I think, Jerry Garcia's on there. Coltrane, in his way of playing free jazz, is going to be really influential on so many rock musicians, people like John McLaughlin. But if you listen to the Byrds, what's the track? The Byrds did a track called, is it 8 Miles High? I'll say 8 Miles High, sorry if I got it wrong. 5 miles high, 8 miles high. But if you listen to that track, they're trying to play like Coltrane, right? And of course, the modal way of playing is going to be used by people like Cream and especially Jimi Hendrix, Okay, so the innovations of how you free jazz allowed rock musicians and blues musicians to expand on what they do, and it's that creates jazz fusion. And jazz fusion is the great invention of jazz in the 1960s, right? Free jazz also, the idea of freeing jazz, freeing yourself from that, is also linked to the civil rights music. The civil rights movement in the 1960s. That you know, a lot of the musicians, you know, the Afro-American musicians in the 60s have become involved in the civil rights. They want freedom from the oppression that is happening in the 1950s, and they're reacting against it. Max wrote his Freedom Jazz Suite, I think that's the name of it. Incredible album. You know, Coltrane. Coltrane's music is not just free, but it's a desperate scream. It's spiritual, right? Coltrane's great innovation in music is to bring spirituality to the centre of music. It's going to become so important for so many artists after that. But it's spirituality, but with a scream. It's also a protest. And musicians like Archie Shepp and Albert Ayler are going to take that scream, and they're going to take that scream right back to the beginnings of jazz and further back than that. And they're going to go back to the scream of the slave. That is embodied in the music. It's not just future, but it's past. Okay? That extremeness in the music is actually going to be influential on 1980s thrash metal. It's going to be influential on hip hop. The Last Poets are growing out of that in the 60s, which is like a jazz poetry, which has a different kind of freedom. But Gil Scott Heron's going to take that sound and he's going to turn it into, you know, the revolution will not be televised in the 1970s. That's going to create hip hop. So free jazz is really, really important in so many ways. And what's important is the idea of freedom. It's the idea of not being held back like a bebop musician is by the chord changes. You know, bebop was really created to stop people coming in. It was to create a way of playing jazz that the old guard, you know, people like Louis Armstrong and the old guys couldn't play. Some of them could. People like Coleman Hawkins could. You know, they just stepped right and started playing bebop, you know. But it was a way of going, this is our music. But free jazz, in the end, did what all great jazz does, and it was inclusive. For me as a jazz musician, if I hadn't have heard Ornette Coleman at the same time as I heard Charlie Parker, I might just have been given up. Because I was a rock musician, I wasn't at music college. No one was explaining to me, you know, how, you know, colour tones work and 2-5-1 chord progressions and jazz chord substitutions, altered dominance. No, I was there with the record, with my ears, trying to pick up what was going on. And Ornette Coleman for me was really difficult to listen to, but his influence was huge on me. And I tell you where it came from. It came from Pat Metheny and John Scofield. Because when I heard them, I really love those players were like Ornette Coleman style players. They were, you know, where someone like John McLaughlin and Larry Coryell, they seemed like more Coltrane style players. But Pat Metheny would play through the chord changes, but he'd play them in a way which was different, and I loved the way he did. He seemed to. He was using that logical phrasing. You know, Pat Metheny will open up a line of inquiry on his instrument, and he will follow down it, but he will go where that wants to go. And someone like Pat Metheny especially would play Ornette Coleman tunes, so I would be able to approach it. Because I've got to be honest, that, you know, how did I get into Ornette Coleman? Song X by Pat Metheny. Listening to Pat Metheny's lines, which I loved, made me appreciate Ornette Coleman's lines. Ornette Coleman's got the additional thing that he often doesn't play in tune. The notes he plays are actually slightly out of tune. That is maybe a discussion for another video, but that's incredible. You know, that is true free jazz. But anyway, we'll leave it there. So yeah, free jazz, really important style of music. I hope I've explained, you know, 3 approaches that you'll pick up by listening, because it is difficult to listen to, and also the protest aspect of free jazz, which is really important. but most importantly, its influence on rock music, and then the influence from rock music back into jazz fusion. I think that's really, really important. A lot of the early jazz fusion players are not mixing bebop with a funky beat. They're not doing it. If they'd done that, it would have been horrible. They're mixing free jazz style soloing with a funky beat. That's really important. So I hope you enjoyed this video, which is my look at free jazz and fusion. If you want to now check out my video on the origins of jazz fusion, that might be a good place to go, because I don't know how much further I don't know whether this is the last one in my history of jazz. We'll see. So if you don't see another one, this could well be the last one, and we'll be moving on to something else. But you never know, I might go over next week and some things might crop into my mind that I'd like to discuss. But anyway, if you like this stuff, you can notice these videos have now turned to a much more sort of philosophical, you know, bent. I think my views will go down now. Maybe I need to do my favourite ELP albums. How about that? Shall we do that next? Yeah, well, there wouldn't be many in there, would there? Okay, so I'll see you all soon, and thanks for watching. Bye.